They told the world the Honduran jungle had finally given back its lost white city, but when the first scan cut through the canopy, it did not reveal one shining ruin. It revealed something far stranger: plazas, mounds, and the outline of a whole human landscape outsiders had failed to see for centuries. So, what was really hiding in the Mosquitia, a lost city, or a myth built on top of a forgotten world? I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Laura. From Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends whispering Latin intrigue. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. First came the light, not a torch, not a conquistador pushing through vines, not some treasure hunter swearing he had seen white walls between the trees. An aircraft crossed the green roof of the Mosquitia in eastern Honduras and fired a rain of invisible pulses into the jungle below. That is where this story truly begins, and the question arrived almost at once. Did the machine find a lost city, or did it expose how badly outsiders had been taught to look? From above, the forest looked as it had always looked: endless, wet, and secretive, the kind of place that makes maps feel nervous. But inside the scan, the leaves started to fall away. The jungle stopped behaving like a wall and became a surface, and that surface began to speak in shapes no river makes by accident: straight lines, raised platforms, open spaces, terraces, mounds. The old legend of the White City suddenly felt closer than ever, and at that same moment it began to fall apart. The tool that made this possible was LiDAR, a laser mapping system that works almost like a storm of measuring light. The aircraft sends down countless pulses. Some strike leaves, some hit branches, some slip through the canopy and touch the ground. The machine times their return, gathers those echoes, and builds a three-dimensional memory of the land. Then the vegetation is peeled away within the model, and what seemed like wild confusion starts to arrange itself into something human, not treasure, not fantasy, intention. That is the first twist. The White City legend trained people to expect a single miracle, one shining place, one secret prize hidden in the green. But the scan did not reveal a gleaming skyline waiting to be photographed. It revealed a pattern: plazas laid out with purpose, earthen mounds shaped by labor, embankments, terraces, and modified ground showed that people had not merely passed through this forest. They had worked it, organized it, and folded their lives into it. The land, as always, kept receipts. So yes, the headlines exploded: Lost City Foundation Civilization Under the Jungle, the kind of words that make producers smile and archaeologists reach for a headache. Because the public story jumped from one true sentence to one false one, the true sentence was that the scans revealed a real ancient settlement beneath the canopy. The false sentence was that someone had finally found the one legendary white city. As if myth and map had snapped together like a lock and key. They had not even close. The story people call La Ciudad Blanca was never one clean indigenous memory handed down untouched through time. Every era added something, and almost every outsider made it brighter, richer, whiter, and simpler than it had been before. By the time the modern audience inherited it, the legend was already wearing many masks at once. Some strands of that older memory were never about a tourist-ready metropolis at all. Among the Peck, stories of a place called Caucamasa, the White House, have often been brought into this conversation. Among the Tawaka, there are memories of lost refuges and ancestral places tied to catastrophe, distance, and survival. These are not carbon copies of one single tale. That matters. Outsiders kept hearing about the hidden city and smelling treasure. Local memory was often speaking instead about refuge, sacred ground, grief, and a world altered by invasion. Then the outsiders arrived with exactly the kind of imagination the forest invites. The Mosquitia is almost too perfect for legend. It is remote, humid, difficult, and full of the kind of silence that makes people project whatever they fear or desire. That is why hidden kingdoms grow so easily there. If a place is hard to reach, people start decorating it in their minds. Wealth goes there, curses go there, lost empires go there. The farther away a place feels, the less discipline fantasy usually needs. By the 20th century, the legend had acquired one of its stickiest costumes, the so-called City of the Monkey God. That version became famous above all because of Theodore Mord, who entered the Mosquitia in 1940, returned with dramatic stories, and let the press feast on them. He helped fuse the White City legend with the image of the monkey god in popular imagination. What he did not bring back was solid archaeological proof strong enough to settle the matter. The myth survived him anyway. And that is how myths work in a place like this. They do not survive because they are precise. They survive because they are useful. A hidden city promises wealth without paperwork, wonder without politics, civilization without descendants. It lets people imagine a spectacular past, while ignoring the living people whose lands, stories, and memories make that past legible in the first place. It turns a homeland into a treasure map. It turns a region into a riddle designed for outsiders to solve. So when the aircraft finally crossed the Mosquitia in the 21st century, it was not entering a blank world. It was entering a forest already crowded with rumor, projection, and unfinished argument. The difference now was that the first great pass over the canopy was not being made by a man trying to prove himself. It was being made by light. And light, unlike legend, does not care what story you want to be true. It times the return, marks the ground, and records the shape that is really there. Once the vegetation was stripped away inside the scan, the forest began confessing architecture in a language the public rarely notices. Not polished towers, not white marble, topography. A level space broad enough to gather a community. A rise too regular to be natural. Long edges shape movement. Slopes altered by repeated labor. Water is handled, guided, and controlled. This is why the discovery mattered. The machine did not just reveal ruins. It revealed that the landscape itself had been taught to obey human plans. One valley became especially important in the conversation that followed, a place later described as Valle de la Fortaleza, the Valley of the Fortress. There, the map terrain pointed not to one lonely ruin, but to a network. 19 settlements are arranged in 3 levels, with a dominant center holding the valley together. That is a very different picture from the old white city fantasy. A singular miracle makes for a better headline. A settlement system makes for better history. And history in this case is far more astonishing. At the heart of that valley stood a major center the researchers called Jaguar City. Notice the wording. Called, not discovered by ancient name, not confirmed as the white city of legend, and not translated from some hidden inscription. Jaguar City was a modern working label, a way to speak about a real place without pretending we know what the people who built it called it. That little act of restraint matters. It is the difference between listening to the ground and forcing the ground to repeat a fantasy. Walk that place in your mind. You come through the trees, and the earth begins to rise in deliberate stages. Plaza after plaza opens like held breath. Mounds stand where buildings once commanded the eye. Terraces step down toward the water and cultivable ground. Smaller features spread outward like neighborhoods or clustered households. Then one great earthen mound lifts above the rest, with signs of a ramp or stair leading towards summit platforms. From above, it is geometry. At ground level, it would have felt like authority made visible. Near that mound, field crews found what looked less like random debris and more like a deliberate offering left in a charged place. Stone bowls, carved objects, special grinding stones known as metates, and images linked to powerful animals such as jaguars and vultures. That matters because it tells us the site was not only practical, it was ceremonial. People gathered there to do more than survive. They staged it there. They tied labor to ritual, status to symbolism, and earth to belief. A place becomes a center when power learns to perform itself. And once you see that, the rest of the valley changes shape in your mind. A plaza is not a space. It is a stage where people meet, trade, witness, dance, judge, mourn, and make offerings. A terrace is not just a cut in the slope, it is planned into the soil. An embankment is not merely dirt piled up, it is labor coordinated over time. Archaeology does not hand us gossip about rulers, but it does preserve the choreography of community. That is a different kind of record. The dates, as best the ground allows us to say for now, place these centers in the late pre-Hispanic world, around the long stretch from the year 1000 to 1500, with some places perhaps shifting earlier or later as more work continues. In other words, these communities were alive in the centuries before and around the first Spanish intrusions into the region. That timing matters. It places the Mosquitia not outside history, but inside a world already full of exchange, tension, movement, and looming disruption. Now comes the question every audience asks. Who were these people? And this is where discipline matters more than romance. The remains do not justify flattening the Mosquitia into simple textbook categories. This was not a case where one can lazily point at the ruins and say, they're obviously Maya, and move on. Eastern Honduras has long been a cultural meeting ground, a frontier in the deeper sense, where influences crossed, mixed, and changed shape. The archaeology points to indigenous societies of northeastern Honduras, but not to an easy label. Could some of those people have been related to the ancestors of historically known groups in the region? Perhaps the Peck most often mentioned in careful discussions? Possibly. But the evidence is not yet the kind that lets us speak with swagger. We do not have long royal inscriptions, neat dynastic lists, or the original name these communities would have used for themselves. So the honest language is also the respectful language. An indigenous society of the Mosquitia built and used these centers. Beyond that, certainty still has to earn its place. That is also why the word discovery begins to rot in the mouth. Years before the famous headlines, archaeologist Chris Begley had already been working in the Mosquitia with Peck collaborators, documenting sites, listening to local knowledge, and treating the region as a lived historical landscape rather than a blank stage for adventure. The scan did not create that deeper reality. It made it harder for outsiders to ignore. There is a difference, and the difference is ethical. Being the loudest voice is not the same as being the first to know. Wait, notice what the Lost City story quietly asks you to believe. It asks you to imagine one city, not a region. Total prior ignorance, not partial knowledge. Outsider revelation, not local memory. Pristine jungle hiding civilization, not forest growing over old human labor. All four of those ideas are seductive, and all four bend the truth. The stronger reading is much simpler and much more powerful. The Mosquitia held substantial pre-Hispanic settlements in engineered landscapes that older methods had badly under-recognized. That is the real revelation. And that revelation belongs to a larger correction that stretches far beyond Honduras. For a very long time, outsiders loved imagining the American tropics as untouched wilderness, pure green emptiness waiting for history to arrive. But the forests of the Americas are often historical landscapes. Burned, planted, managed, terraced, settled, reshaped, remembered. The jungle does not erase people as cleanly as fantasy would have it. Sometimes it preserves their work in low relief, in subtle lines, in altered slopes and water channels, until the right eyes learn how to see. That is part of what makes LiDAR feel almost magical on first encounter. It teaches modern viewers to see low, earthy, distributed forms of complexity that older habits kept dismissing. Before the scan, many people could imagine only one kind of greatness: the bright stone city, the skyline, the palace. But human societies do not all announce themselves in the same accent. Some write power into terraces, roads, house platforms, reservoirs, embankments, and ceremonial grounds spread across a valley. Complexity can be distributed. Monumentality can be quiet. You can see the same lesson in other rainforest worlds, where laser mapping has repeatedly turned isolated ruins into whole inhabited systems. What looked from the ground like a mound or two becomes, when viewed from above, a network of roads, terraces, platforms, reservoirs, and link centers. The Mosquitia belongs inside that broader revolution in seeing, not because it copies every other place, it does not, but because it confirms the same humbling truth. The forest was not hiding emptiness. It was a hiding scale. That is a very different kind of secret, which is why the old adjective white becomes so interesting. White stone, white walls, a white city glowing in the green, all of that belongs more to expectation than to what the mapped ground actually shows. The above points to earthworks, plazas, terraces, and modified terrain. That does not mean the legend emerged from nothing. Legends rarely do. It means the label drifted away from the place it claimed to describe. A story about whiteness ended up sitting atop an earthen landscape built by repeated human effort. And yet, in a small and almost mocking way, the ground seems to answer the legend back. Around some important spaces, the remains hint at ritual features supported by pale quartz stones. There it is, a flash of white after all, but not the towering city of outsider fantasy. Just a detail, a ceremonial accent, a glimmer at the edge of a plaza. History loves that sort of irony. A myth promises a blinding metropolis. The land replies with a handful of white stones and a much deeper truth. So what kind of place was this, really? Not a temporary camp, not a random scatter of huts swallowed by luck and vines. The built spaces imply settled communities with public architecture, coordinated labor, ritual life, and managed surroundings. People likely farmed these slopes and lowlands, staged ceremonies in these plazas, and moved goods through exchange networks that linked them to wider worlds. What the ground gives us is spatial history. It tells us how life was arranged. What it does not yet give us is the full political biography, That missing biography matters. The Mosquitia archaeology does not hand us named rulers, dynasties, court scandals, or a neat royal timeline the way some better-known centers do. There are no surviving texts here telling us what each mound was called or which family claimed the summit. The evidence is powerful, but it is a different kind of power. It lets us reconstruct the skeleton of a society, not every face. And frankly, there is something honest in that. The past does not always owe us a full confession. Then comes the question people want answered in the most dramatic possible way. What happened to it? What ended these centers? What made the plazas fall quiet and the terraces surrender to roots? The truth is less cinematic than the myth, and that is exactly why it deserves respect. What likely happened here was abandonment over time, not a magical disappearance in a single cursed night. The jungle did not swallow a white metropolis whole. Human worlds rarely end that neatly. They fray, shift, weaken, relocate, and then go silent. Could disease have played a role after the arrival of Europeans to the wider region, even before direct contact reached every valley? Absolutely, that is one possibility the history of the Americas forces us to take seriously. Could political change, migration, conflict, ecological stress, or shifting routes of exchange also have mattered? Of course. What we do not have is firm proof for one single cause marching in like a final villain. So the most honest answer is also the least theatrical. These communities were occupied, organized, and later abandoned. The exact process remains unclear. And that uncertainty is precisely where bad storytelling rushes in. When people do not know how a place ended, they start filling the silence with curses, divine punishment, monkey gods, vanished gold, or a city swallowed overnight for its sins. But uncertainty is not an invitation to lie. It is an invitation to stay close to the evidence. The evidence says there were real centers here. The evidence says they mattered. The evidence says they were later left behind. The rest for now is shadow, and shadow is not proof. This is also where the legend does its most dangerous work. A hidden, fabulous city sounds romantic until you notice what disappears inside that phrase. The people become abstract. The living descendants of the region become background scenery. Local knowledge is reduced to folklore until a machine or an outsider validates it. The landscape becomes valuable only when it resembles somebody else's fantasy of civilization. That is the old colonial grammar speaking in a modern accent. It sounds adventurous. Underneath, it still asks the same ugly question: who counts as a knower? The Mosquitia answers that question in its own way. Peck, Tawaka, Mesquitu, Garifuna, and other communities are not decorative footnotes to this story. They belong to the living human world around them. That does not mean every ancient mound can be neatly assigned to one modern identity. History is more tangled than that. But it does mean we should stop talking as if the past of this region lay asleep until outsiders arrived to wake it. The land was never empty. The memory was never empty. Only the old narrative was. There is another reversal hiding here, and it is the most beautiful one. People love saying the jungle refused to give the city back, but that sentence is wrong in the wrong place. The jungle gave back exactly what it had preserved: patterns of settlement, modified slopes, earthen monuments, ceremonial spaces, the topographic grammar of a human. What refused to change was the outsider expectation. So many people were still searching for a skyline, for white walls, for one perfect treasure. The ground kept offering something truer and something more troubling. Because once you accept that the Mosquitia was not an empty wilderness, but a peopled landscape, the moral stakes rise. These are not just adventure ruins. They are evidence of societies whose worlds were later fractured by conquest, disease, displacement, and long neglect. The romance starts to curdle. You cannot keep the thrill of discovery without also facing the history that made so much of that older world vulnerable, fragmented, and easy for later storytellers to exoticize. The legend wants spectacle. The truth demands responsibility. Even now, the story is not only about the distant past. Forests are cut, rivers change, roads advance. A place can survive centuries under a canopy and still be damaged in an instant by modern greed. That is another reason the scans matter. They are not merely dramatic images for documentaries. They are records, warnings, and sometimes rescues in digital form, preserving the memory of surfaces that may not remain intact forever. The irony is bitter. At times, the laser map arrives just in time to remember what the chainsaw is about to erase. And the map kept widening. As more work spread across eastern Honduras, the picture continued to grow beyond the fantasy of a single impossible city. More sites, more patterns, more evidence that the old legend had been sitting on top of a broader inhabited world than most outsiders ever imagined. That is the real scale of the correction. Not one jewel in the forest, but a necklace of places. Not one answer, but a region. Not one miracle, but a history of repeated occupation, labor, and memory across difficult terrain. Go back now to the opening image, the aircraft over the canopy, the white pulse falling through green darkness. At first, it feels like a recovery story, as if technology finally rescued a lost city from the jungle's jealous grip. But listen more carefully. The machine did not rescue a fairy tale. It stripped away the habits that kept outsiders looking for the wrong thing. It taught the eye to value earthworks, subtle relief, distributed settlement, and lived landscape. The scan did not just reveal the Mosquitia, it corrected us. That is why the White City story became more plausible to the public while also becoming less accurate. More plausible because, yes, there really were substantial pre-Hispanic centers hidden beneath the canopy. Less accurate because the truth turned out to be bigger, more regional, more indigenous, and far less obedient to fantasy than the old legend allowed. The public wanted one dramatic city. The land answered with networks, plazas, terraces, mounds, and memory. The public wanted a myth confirmed. The archaeology gave back a landscape instead. And honestly, that landscape is the more haunting thing. A single lost city belongs to adventure fiction. A whole inhabited world dimly preserved under a rainforest canopy belongs to history. And history is harder to shake. It means children once ran across those plazas. Farmers cut those terraces into the slope. Ritual specialists set offerings where power needed to be seen. Families built, argued, traded, buried, and remembered there. Then the rhythms changed, the voices thinned, and the forest slowly rose over the outlines of their decisions. So no, the clean version of the old legend does not survive contact with the ground. There is no solid basis for a literal shining metropolis of white stone hidden intact in the Honduran rainforest. There is no firm reason to believe one single site can be confidently crowned the white city of all the stories. And there is no evidence for one dramatic night when a cursed civilization vanished whole. What survives instead is both smaller in image and larger in meaning, a complex archaeological landscape that myth had badly simplified. That is the real lesson of La Ciudad Blanca, the White City. Not that the jungle guarded a fairy tale until modern science cracked the code, but that a legend was sitting on top of a real historical world and distorting it. The old story looked upward towers. The better story looks outward across a valley, seeing relationships, settlements, engineered ground, ritual spaces, and local memory. Once you make that shift, the Mosquitia stops being a backdrop for conquest fantasies and becomes what it always was, a homeland layered with human time. And maybe that is the sharpest part of the whole tale. The people who built these places may not have left us the names outsiders crave, but they left something just as powerful. They left a pattern. They left evidence of cooperation, ceremony, planning, and persistence in a landscape outsiders kept mistaking for emptiness. In that sense, the jungle was never the true obstacle. The obstacle was the gaze that could not recognize civilization unless it resembled a postcard. The scan did not awaken the past. It awakened a different way of seeing. So when someone says the White City was finally found, listen closely to what is being smuggled inside that sentence. Hear the singular city replacing a whole region. Hear the outsider claiming first sight over generations of local knowledge. Hear the romance of the untouched jungle trying to bury the truth of a humanized land. Then let the ground answer. Let the plazas, mounds, terraces, embankments, and altered slopes speak in their own quieter voice. They tell a harder story than the legend and a more honest one. The white pulse returns here first, one last time, as the light falls from the aircraft. Then, as the fantasy of white walls in the mind of the outsider. Then, as pale courts at the edge of ritual space, a whisper of brightness instead of a blinding city. I love that image because it feels like history correcting myth without completely humiliating it. The legend was not pure invention, it was a distorted echo. The problem came when people mistook the echo for the whole room. In the end, La Ciudad Blanca is not a story about a city the jungle refused to give back. It is a story about a landscape outsiders kept failing to read because they wanted one glorious answer instead of a human world. And that to me is far more unsettling. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.